A.T. Walden, on the front lines of Atlanta civil rights. The late 19th and early 20th centuries presented significant changes in the United States regarding civil rights. The 14th and 15th Amendments marked a pivotal turning point for signifying positive growth and equality in American society, guaranteeing citizenship to former slaves and granting voting rights to all races. However, these encouraging changes failed to protect African Americans from the negative responses imposed by Southern white culture. Freedom of enslaved African Americans did not necessarily mean true freedom in the early 20th century South. The United States federal government made adjustments that began a positive movement in American society, yet some of the positive changes led to negative responses. African Americans were granted rights, but were not granted protection from inequality. Atlanta suffered from extreme prejudice against African Americans during the Jim Crow era and thus hindered equal practice in the legal and voting systems. Without the influence of Austin Thomas Walden, civil equalities would not be what they are in present-day Atlanta. Exploring A.T. Walden's involvement in the Atlanta community is imperative for Southern natives and outsiders alike. For what he did deserves attention in present day to understand how we have our rights, and to perhaps strengthen the equality A.T. Walden fought for in the past. Being only one of a few African American lawyers in Georgia at the beginning of the 20th century, A.T. Walden became a noted civil rights leader, reshaping the lives of the African American community in the South. Walden was born in Fort Valley on April 12, 1885, to former slaves Jenny Tomlin and Jeff Walden. He soon stood out as a noteworthy person when he was the only graduate in the class of 1902 at Fort Valley High and Industrial School. He continued his education at Atlanta University, earning his B.A. in 1907, and then attended the University of Michigan Law School, where he earned his law degree in 1911. Walden returned to Georgia following law school, where he braved a legal career in Jim Crow South as a black attorney. He later joined the Army and served as a captain and assistant judge advocate during World War I. After the war, he returned home and moved his law practice from Macon to Atlanta. Walden earned a national reputation as a civil rights lawyer by litigating civil rights cases to help equalize pay for black teachers in Georgia, which effectively helped to desegregate Atlanta public schools, as well as the University of Georgia. He would soon become the founder and co-chair of the nonpartisan Atlanta Negro Voters League, abbreviated ANVIL, in 1949, which was a political organization used to maximize the strength of the black vote. The New Georgia Encyclopedia states that such an organization was needed because of the surge in black voter registration after a 1946 federal court ruling invalidated Georgia's all-white primary. With these visible political positions, Walden was able to exercise great political influence on behalf of black Atlantans. As the rate of black voting increased in the 1940s, significant progress was made in the black community, such as street and sewer improvements and the hiring of black policemen in African American neighborhoods. Walden's reputation was one that radiated through many influential people of society, as this can be seen in a letter from W.T. Andrews sent to W.E.B. Du Bois suggesting Walden for the 1930 Spingarn Medal. During his 18 years in the practice of law, including part of 3 years in training and service of the United States Army, Mr. Walden has defended scores of race victims in Macon, where he practiced his first 5 years, here in Atlanta the past 11 years, and occasionally at other places throughout the state. Walden was also affiliated with Dr. Martin Luther King, as this can be seen in a letter from Walden to Dr. King following a speech they conducted together. David Pye's article, Complex Relations, An African American Attorney Navigates Jim Crow Atlanta, explains that when the United States entered the First World War, race leader W.E.B. Du Bois called upon black men to join the Army. Walden did so. Along with other college-educated blacks at the segregated Reserve Officer Corps training facility in Des Moines, Iowa, he served as an officer. Walden performed admirably, commanding a company that acted as judge for black soldiers charged with military crimes. Captain Walden resigned his commission at war's end and moved to Atlanta to practice law. In the Georgia capital, Walden began his task of uplifting the black race. Du Bois recognized Walden as a civil leader and even requested his help with one of his publications. Du Bois wrote a letter to Mr. Walden asking for assistance. "I want to get some information concerning the colored people and the Atlanta bond issues in Atlanta. Have you anything that has been published, or can you give me the main facts concerning the more important recent bond elections and the attitude of the colored people and what they were promised, what they received, and what they did not receive? I want to use it in some work I am preparing for publication. I should be greatly obliged. Very sincerely yours, W.E.B. Du Bois." As the African American community was growing in strength throughout the political society, civil inequalities still persisted. Georgia continued to suffer repressive social order that prevented the number of practicing black attorneys from increasing throughout the early 20th century. Pye asserts, from the 1920s to the late 1940s, only Walden and his sometime partner, Thomas J. Henry, actively practiced law. Henry suffered from severe hearing loss during the First World War, forcing him to leave most courtroom duties to Walden. Thus, Walden was, for the most part, the only black attorney working in Atlanta courtrooms. As the notion of separate but equal began to take root, many all-black communities came into existence. However, the formation of these communities did not seem to hinder the majority of occupations held by African Americans, such as physicians, butchers, and bankers, for they all could practice their black-only businesses with black-only patrons. A black lawyer, however, inevitably found himself dealing with white judges, white court clerks, and white police officers. Yet despite these obstacles, Walden still chose to practice law in Atlanta. His persistence to fight through the racial barrier ultimately earned him respect among the local justice system. Pye explains that whenever the city officials sought to prosecute white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan or the Black Shirts, they often requested that Walden participate in the case. Though never directly arguing in court against these groups, Walden, by his very presence in the courtroom, sent the message that progressive elements in Atlanta would unify against racial extremism. However, Walden did not stop with just the courtroom in Atlanta. He sought to change the voting practices. Although there was an increase in Negro voting, they were denied their voting rights both by legal and extra-legal means. These unfair practices of the voting system undoubtedly crushed the African American turnout to the polls. Jack Walker's article, Negro Voting in Atlanta, 1953 to 1961, claims that increased voting among Negroes will undoubtedly have a significant impact on the development of Southern politics. But most studies of Negro voting have concluded that non-whites are less likely to vote than whites. Connolly and Field, in a study of non-voting, reported that only 34% of the non-whites in their samples had voted in 1940, in contrast to the 71% of the Caucasians. Due to the formation of Walden's Anvil, he assisted voter registration among black citizens and encouraged them to go to the polls. Anvil quickly registered 10,000 blacks for the 1949 primary election, a sharp contrast to the mere 958 black voters in 1935. Austin Thomas Walden was unquestionably a man that changed Southern society. Coming from former slave parents, excelling at school, continuing his education to an elitist level, and serving his nation as a soldier, Walden undoubtedly developed the strength needed to overturn the unequal Jim Crow South. He fought against diversity and gave power to the minority, and in doing so, garnered respect from the government, other famous leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and most importantly, the African American community of Atlanta.